My first and only guest today is a unique and talented individual. She is an author, an art historian, a public speaker, and a broadcaster, specializing in literature, art and history, and social history from the 19th and early 20th centuries. She is also an award winning travel writer with a love of the environment. Cetaceans are one of her passions, and she's also a volunteer speaker for the Whales and Dolphins Conservation Society. And if that was not enough, she is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Charles and Catherine Dickens and has written several books about Mr. Dickens. For the past decade, she has been a patron of the Charles Dickens Museum in London and a patron of the Norwegian Pickwick Club as well. Ladies and gentlemen, as she's being beamed in from London, there she is, Miss Lucinda Hawksley. Hi, Lucinda.
Hello. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Lucinda and I met a couple of years ago with my wife, who had already met her before because they had done a reading of A Christmas Carol, I think, some portions of that. Back a few years ago. And then we had a chance to be visiting London, and we got together at that time and had a lovely get together. So it's wonderful for you to be on the show. We thank you so much. Now, I know you have been to the States many times. Have you ever been to New Hampshire or New England?
I haven't. I'm sorry. I would love to come, but I always seem to be going to Texas or New York or Philadelphia, somewhere like that. Washington. Yeah.
Not even Boston yet.
Actually, I have been to Boston. I've been to Boston once. You're right. Many years ago. And I loved it, actually. Thought it was a really great city. I didn't know that much about it, but I had so much fun.
It's quite a lovely town, and it's about under 2 hours from here, about 90 minutes plus you can get there. But yeah. Well, we will, as when we have the theater opened later this year and we start to put our programming in there, hopefully we will have a Dickens weekend or a week and in 21 or 22, and we will get you over here for that.
Good. And let's hope flying is safe and we can all get back to a vague semblance of normality.
Agreed. Anyone that has the travel bug right now is it's tough. I mean, there's so many reasons it's tough, and more important than that. But for those who like to travel, it's tough right now. And gosh knows our country, we can't even travel to the European Union countries. So, but hopefully, yes, things will get better. We will keep hoping that and keep doing the right things. Before we get to your work, I'd love for you to tell a little bit about your background, where in England you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school and education, and then we can get into some other areas after that.
Well, we moved around a bit when I was little. So I was born in Sheffield in Yorkshire. And then I didn't stay there very long. We lived in Derbyshire, which is absolutely beautiful. And people watching this may think, why do I know the name Derbyshire? And it's where Mr. Darcy comes from in Pride and Prejudice. And I would urge you, if you're coming to the UK, it's a beautiful place to visit. But we moved from there when I was still small. And then we moved down to Somerset to live near the sea, a place called Clevedon, which is just a really pretty little seaside town. And then we moved east to Buckinghamshire, which is not far from London. And then when I went to university, I went to university in London, and I love it, and I've never left. It's a fabulous city. I love living here. It's very, very strange at the moment, as we're still in what we call lockdown. And although it's easing a little bit, a few things have opened up, it's still a very different city from how London is normally. So it's an interesting time to be here.
I can only imagine. We have not been down to New York since March. Elisa was down there shooting a CBS TV show she was guest starring in, and she left when she wrapped that, and then she got home and she learned that someone on the set was COVID positive. So that started March off, and then the domino effect later that week and mid-March that everything started shutting down. But
Yeah.
New York, everywhere, but especially large towns. It's large cities. It's very peculiar of how they look when they are in lockdown, and not just for a day, but for weeks on end. Um, so tell us, when you have a family connection to one of the world's greatest novelists, and certainly who better designs characters than Charles Dickens? Their characters are sometimes bigger than their books in a way.
Yeah.
He is so good at that. Um, but how and even like, when did you first grasp the enormity that as a child, that I'm related to this? All these books are his, and how did that affect you?
Well, when I was little, I at primary school, I think I was probably about 6 or 7. Our teacher asked us if we'd ever heard of Charles Dickens, and I was a bit disconcerted. I thought perhaps it was my parents playing a trick on me or something. So I said, "He's my great-great-great-grandfather," thinking you know, this was just some kind of strange thing. And the way she reacted, she kind of went, and I thought, oh, other people know who he is. So I knew that he'd written Oliver because I'd been to see it at the theatre, and I knew that he'd written A Christmas Carol. I think I knew that already, but I hadn't really realised that other people really knew who he was, if that makes sense. When you're
Mm.
little, you don't kind of think about the fact that if it's on at the theatre, it's probably quite big. And I just didn't realize that other people knew who he was. So that was quite interesting to me. And then I felt a bit embarrassed about it at school. The next schools I went to, I always kept it completely quiet because I felt quite nervous. And then when I was at university, I hadn't really studied Dickens until I went to university, in fact, not properly, which I think is wonderful because I was of an age when I absolutely fell in love with his work. And I had the most fabulous Dickens teacher, a lovely man called Tim Jordan, sadly no longer alive. And he discovered it because he went to the Dickens Museum and my name was on the family tree. And he came back in and made a comment about it in class. And he said he'd never seen anyone go so red in their life. He actually apologized to me afterwards. Now it's a huge part of my career, and my publishers instantly took it and ran with it. And suddenly I talk about it all the time, and I'm a patron of the museum and I write about Dickens. But when I was younger, I was almost quite embarrassed at people knowing, because it just felt such a strange thing. And people would always look at you and say things like, oh, we've got to study him. And they weren't impressed by that.
Now, did some of his work, or were there other influences of you becoming a writer yourself? I mean, did that influence you at all?
It's interesting. People often assume that it was Dickens that made me want to be a writer. And actually, of course, I wasn't reading Dickens when I was little. So a couple of writers I absolutely loved as a child were Roald Dahl, I'm sure many of you know, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and things, and then a woman called Penelope Lively, who, like Roald Dahl, wrote for adults as well as children. And there were various children's books of hers that I just loved. And I think those two writers, more than anything, made me want to tell stories. Um, there's a lot of us who are related to Dickens, living today, and actually I'm the only one in a couple of generations who's a writer. So I don't think it's necessarily just the Dickens thing. I've just always wanted to write stories ever since I can remember. I mean, when I was little, I used to say I was going to write books for children, which I haven't done as an adult, but would never rule out. It's just something that's always been in me, I think. And
Yeah.
as any writer will know, you don't have to be related to another writer. If you are a writer, you just know, you just have to do it.
Sometimes I think it can, just like any other profession, if mom or dad is a writer, a plumber, whatever, that occasionally you see it handed down. I mean, I think over in your country, the Amos family, the
Yes,
Kingsley and
Martin Amis.
Martin, yeah, and but certainly not mandated in any sense. But
No.
it's just curious sometimes how some avoid it, or they embrace it, or
I was going to say, I think most growing up with a parent who was a writer would think, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to get a job that pays something.
yeah,
They're not going to
yeah,
go
no.
for a career choice.
It's like the acting career,
Yeah, totally.
same, similar.
It's a
Yeah.
vocation. It truly is
As,
a vocation, actually. I do think writing is a vocation. We do it because we feel compelled to, and we love it.
yeah. Yeah. I think you're right on that. I think the most writers would agree with you on that. Um, Now, you have published around 20 books in your career.
Yes.
they certainly include a handful about your great-great-great-grandfather,
Yeah.
but you also you write about the era that he lived in, and you write about travel, and you write about the. I think you've written about the environment as well.
Not, I haven't written a book about the environment, but I have written articles when I've
Yeah,
worked in journalism. But a lot of my books are about art history because I'm an art
yeah,
historian. I teach
yeah.
literature and art history. And I've written 3 biographies of female artists, one of whom is Charles Dickens's daughter, Katie. And it was really through Katie that I started to get an interest in writing about Dickens's life. So I started with Katie and then started writing about Charles and various other family members and friends. But she was a fascinating woman, Katie. She was a portrait painter. She was incredibly well known in her own time and made a very good career as a professional artist. Her second husband was Italian, so she painted under her married name, which was Kate Perugini. Perhaps if she'd painted as Katie Dickens, she might be better known today and better remembered. The other 2 artists I've written biographies of are Lizzie Siddal, who is the pre-Raphaelite supermodel. She was the woman who posed for Millet's Ophelia. She was married to Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and she was also an artist and poet as well. And then the other one is Princess Louise, who's totally fascinating, one of Queen Victoria's children, who was a sculptor and so forgotten, it's astonishing. But if you've got any people who are watching this from Canada, for example, she is the person whom Lake Louise was named after. She lived in Canada for 5 years and quite a few of her sculptures are there. So it's a kind of interesting, diverse career. And each book that you write kind of leads you onto something else. So my Lizzie and Katie biographies led me onto Princess Louise because she just kept popping up in my research. And I think, who's this princess going to studio parties and hanging out with artists? And through writing about female artists, I started to look at the suffrage movement. So that led on to a book I wrote called March Women March, Voices of the Women's Movement, which was fascinating, looking at how women in Britain particularly struggled for the vote from the 18th century right up until we finally got the vote. And all women were enfranchised not until 1928 in Britain. The first women got it in 1918, but we'd been fighting a long time. So a lot of these things just grow out of other books that you're writing, and you make a note and think, well, that's quite interesting, and then it grows into something else.
There's some of the topics that I've seen. I certainly have not read them all, but looking at your list of books, one that struck out, which was in 2016, "Bitten by Witch Fever."
Oh, that
What's
was
that
fun.
all about?
It's about arsenic in the Victorian home, and it actually comes from a quotation by William Morris, the great designer and artist who I'm a huge fan of. And he, however, did not believe that the arsenic that was used, and arsenic was used to create this wonderful green paint, which had a greenness unlike anything ever seen before, and designers and artists loved it. And then, of course, people started to die as a result of arsenic poisoning. And William Morris, strangely, was somebody who didn't think that arsenic, even though he knew it was a poison, I mean, it was used as a rat poison, he didn't think that arsenic in wallpaper could affect people. And he said the doctors had been bitten as they had been bitten by witch fever, obviously referring to Salem and the witch trials there. So he, however, was a good businessman, and people were asking for arsenic-free wallpaper. So he was one of the first people to produce arsenic-free wallpaper, but he never ever believed that arsenic was a problem. So this book showcases a lot of the gorgeous wallpapers, many of which were by William Morris, not all of them, which are at the National Archives in London. And we had to wear gloves when we were going through them because these wallpaper samples are laced with arsenic, and not just the green. That was the fascinating thing. So many of the different colors, almost all of them, in fact. But however, I wanted to look at the role that arsenic played in general. So it also colored fashions, so beautiful dresses. A lot of women would wear green headdresses, kind of like laurel wreaths almost. They were very fashionable in the mid-Victorian era, and they were, of course, made with arsenic colored paint. So you've not only got the people wearing them and the people they're dancing with, but also the entire fashion industry and the very poorly paid workers who are dying of arsenic poisoning. You've also got people who are working in the arsenic mines. They're the copper mines, which end up producing arsenic. But then I wanted to look at murder as well, and how suddenly the murder, the poison as a woman's weapon starts to become a feature of murder. And then all the incredible golden age crime fiction, interestingly dominated by female writers, people like Agatha
Yeah.
Christie, Ngaio Marsh, Dorothy L.
Mm.
Sayers. Oh, a whole fascinating era to me. I love that period of crime fiction. So Yeah, it goes right the way through famous arsenic murder trials in the Victorian times through to, fictional crimes. So the whole spectrum. It was
Fascinating.
a really fun book to work on.
Now, now, obviously, the workers I can understand were probably dying. Sadly, how many must have been dying from it? But
You have no
were
choice.
there?
You afford to not work.
Oh, what about the users? I mean, if you're having close contact, like in hair pieces and clothing,
Yeah,
were there any accidental deaths to the
there
people that
were.
would buy the clothing?
And probably a lot of them were not actually recorded as arsenic deaths because the symptoms often looked like something like cholera or dysentery, which were very common at the time. So people were really, doctors were writing very early on, writing articles in things like the Lancet and the British Medical Journal about the dangers of arsenic in fashion, and even things like a green shaded lamp shade. That could be coloured with arsenic. And of course, the hotter the lamp got, the more it would kind of give off arsenic kind of gases. So all these kind of things, but it took a long time for people to actually accept that it was a problem, because this particular shade of green was immensely fashionable and people loved it.
Hmm.
And you look at work of people like the Pre-Raphaelites and those who came after them, artists, who I write a lot about and teach about, and they just loved this green. It was this wonderful green that could just give this color that nobody had ever managed to achieve before, and it was immensely fashionable.
Was there an understanding at the time that arsenic was also a toxic
Oh yeah,
element that could kill anyone with a drop or two of it?
that's what's so extraordinary. It was widely sold as a rat poison, and one of the commercial names for rat poison was called Paris Green, because it was used, the arsenic Paris Green was used to kill the rats in the Paris sewers, and yet the name of the paint was also called Paris Green. So it's, really, really astounding. And yet
Wow.
people always say, oh, that's crazy, but you know what, we're being told so much today. People give warnings about mobile phones, about microwaves. I just go, oh, they're fine, they're fine. Who's to say that in 50 years' time people will say, well, of course they were all dying of brain tumours, they were using, whatever. So you can scoff and laugh, but actually a lot of the things that we eat, that we drink, that, maybe in the future people will say, oh, I just can't believe they did that. And, you believe what you want to believe a lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, I had no idea that's where that book title was going, and I think we will be searching that out. There's another you have a book on facial hair.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Art, actually. It's kind of subtitle is Facial Hair and Portraiture. So it's called Moustaches, Whiskers and Beards. And I wrote this with the National Portrait Gallery in London, which is a gallery that I've worked with for, I think, the last 13 years, actually. And it's a really interesting kind of gallery. It's wonderful. And I, because I'm a biographer, the portrait gallery is obviously somewhere very, very fascinating to me. Sadly, if you're planning to come over to London in the next couple of years, it's closed for a huge refurbishment, but you can check out their collections online. And I started being asked to do kind of tours around the gallery, showing some of the funny things that we hadn't picked up on. So we picked up on things like headgear, hats and fashion. And we decided that I should do one on facial hair because there are some hilarious examples, particularly in the Tudor and 19th century galleries, of crazy facial hair. And actually it became quite fascinating. So I did a couple of tours and then I did a lunchtime lecture. And it was really kind of picking up on the zeitgeist. It was when the big beard was just coming in. And apologies for anyone watching with a big beard, but it's not my favorite form of men's attire. And they told me I had to face my fear and do it anyway. And I discovered what a fascinating history there is, particularly in the 19th century, but in how much in Britain, particularly, that's where I was looking at, the fashion for facial hair happens when women are in power in the UK. It's really odd. So the most heavily bearded times in British history are under Queen Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II. It's really strange. And then when kings come into power, then shave. And it's not something I expected to find, but it's definitely tied up with the women's movement. If you think of the 70s with women's lib and the huge beards that were happening then, and even now with the whole idea of the new feminism. So it's not something I expected to find at all, but it just kept coming up as a theme. But really, it's a fun book. It's a book that looks at gives the history of facial hair from ancient times onwards. But it really was just an excuse to bring out some hilarious shockers of portraits and photographs.
Well,
from ancient to present day.
and you speak about the National Portrait Gallery, and that is one of our favorites there too. It is really an amazing museum, and
It is.
it does go hand in hand with biography. But their collection from spans centuries and centuries uh, to current art all the way back
Yeah.
hundreds hundreds of years. Yeah, fabulous place. Um, if we go back for a second, to Mr. Dickens, um, I wondered if you could tell us a story or two that might people might not necessarily know. They certainly have read or seen a movie adaptation of many of his novels, but I just wondered if there, since you are such an expert on him, that you might be able to give us a couple of tidbits on some stories behind the stories.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm working on at the moment is I'm actually writing a book on Dickens and travel, which is something I've been interested in doing for years. And I wonder if people watching this are aware of quite how much Dickens travelled. You may be aware that he came to the States. He came twice. In 1842, he had his 30th birthday in Boston, and he travelled not only to the US, but he travelled to Canada as well on that occasion with his wife, Catherine. They were fairly newly married. They had young children who didn't come with them. And then 25 years later, in the winter of 1867 to 68, he came back to the States again, didn't go to Canada that time. But by this time, he was separated from his wife, and he was obviously much older, and he looks very old in the images. He's actually not. He's only in his mid-50s, but he died at the age of 58, just a couple of years after returning to England. So it really was a very different tour, the second one, but absolutely fascinating to look at his travels around the States and the things that he wrote on that first journey. He actually wrote his first travelogue called American Notes, which I'd really suggest you read. It's a fascinating book to read and would probably teach you a lot about the history of America and what it was like to travel
And
around America.
he did visit, as I remember, because there's some unpublished diaries or something like that. He visited prisons and insane asylums, did he not?
Absolutely. Well, you see, his father had been imprisoned for debt when Charles Dickens was 12. And in fact, Elizabeth, his mother, and all the younger siblings ended up in the debtor's prison with John Dickens, the father, because they couldn't afford to pay rent. And that was when Charles Dickens lived by himself and worked in a factory. Now, he didn't want people to know this at the time. His father did manage to come out of prison within less than a year, go back to his job, but this was a shameful secret at that time. Now, of course, people would make much of it and say, how incredible that you got beyond that and how amazing. But Dickens found it a very shameful secret. He didn't really tell anybody. He only told a couple of people in his adult life. Almost no one was aware of this, but as a result, he was constantly interested in prison reform. He liked to go around and kind of almost check them like a prison inspector to make sure that people were okay. And he would write about those experiences, and he would get very angry about the injustices of the criminal justice system. And lots of places he went in the world, as well as around the UK, he would go and check out prisons. He also spent a year living in Italy, which I think many people aren't aware of, which is one of my favorite times in his life. Just after Christmas Carol came out, actually, he was exhausted. He'd had a terrible year the year before, the year between coming back from America and going to Italy, and he really struggled with depression. And although we know of Christmas Carol as this huge success, he didn't, of course, know beforehand what a success it was going to be, and he was in serious financial trouble. So he rented out his home in England, and he traveled to Italy with all his family because it was so much cheaper to live in Italy. Doesn't look like it because he lived in a palazzo, but it was much, much cheaper. He could rent his place out and live like a king in Italy and be okay financially. So he also went to Switzerland for several months. All of this except for the first American trip with his family. And he lived in Paris for a few months, and they would spend their summers in Boulogne. He spent his sons to be educated in Boulogne in France. So he was a real traveler, and he absolutely loved it. He'd have found lockdown very frustrating, I have to say.
Now, we were talking earlier today, that you said there are not a lot of secrets per se, because the man has been studied, and every piece of paper and rock has been turned over about his life. But occasionally something pops up, and that at the time that we were visiting London a couple of years ago, something did pop up. And if you could tell us the story about that, because you were quite involved with it.
This is very exciting. And this was a painting of Charles Dickens that was actually painted in 1843 at the exact time that he was writing A Christmas Carol. And as I said, he was having a rather difficult year. And it was painted by a remarkable woman called Margaret Gillies, who was a Scottish artist who'd been pretty much forgotten. And with this discovery, she started to come back again. So basically, she painted this portrait in 1843. It was exhibited in 1844 at the Royal Academy in London, which is a major art gallery, the most important art gallery in Britain at the time. And then it was not seen again. And it was lost for almost 175 years. Everybody assumed, including the artist, that it had been destroyed. And then about 18 months ago, a couple of years ago, there was a discovery in South Africa. We still don't know for certain how this painting, it's a miniature, it's a kind of large scale miniature, it's probably about this big. So it's not a tiny miniature, but it's still small. It's absolutely beautiful. And somehow it had ended up in a box of junk being sold in South Africa in a kind of house sale. And the person who bought it bought the entire box of junk, which had, children's toys and broken things in there, for the equivalent of £27, which I guess is, I don't know what the exchange rate is, maybe about $40 or something. And in that was a portrait that this person thought just looked really kind of rubbish. It had mold all over it. It was quite disgusting. But there was something about the eyes they could see that they thought looked quite intriguing, and wondered if it bore a resemblance to a young Charles Dickens. And of course, most people know of Dickens as older with a big beard, but at this time he was kind of modeling himself on the Romantic poets. He had quite long hair, clean shaven, very much a dandy, and luckily contacted the Philip Mould Gallery in London, who have a great miniatures expert called Emma Rutherford, and she had a look at this and were amazed. They were both amazed, and so they contacted the Dickens Museum, and nobody could believe it. I wasn't told about it at first because it was so secret. They were so terrified something was going to happen. And I remember going in to do some research, and Louisa, the curator, saying to me, "I need to have a word with you." And she took me into a room and she said, "It's a complete secret." And it was just amazing. We couldn't tell anyone for ages. And I think that you were in London, Steve, when it had just started to hit and the newspapers had heard about it, and we were raising money to try and buy it, because once this person learned, of course, that it was Dickens, it was worth a lot more than the £27 they'd paid for it quite quickly. The museum did manage to secure the funding thanks to some really generous grants from people. And so it's now inside the the Dickens Museum in London. And it went on display at the end of last year, but of course the museum's been closed for ages at the moment. Excuse me.
Well, we did have that opportunity at the Philip Mould Gallery that we did pop, as you had recommended to us, because I think it was only a couple of days ago, was the press conference that about it happening.
Just the right time at the end of 2018. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was quite lovely. And and of course we were at the oh my God, what's the club across the street?
We were at Somerset House
not Somerset. No, right across from Mould on the
one's on Pall Mall. Were you at the Institute of Directors or the RAC Club or something?
I'm forgetting the Explorers Club. Is that no?
Oh yeah, the Travellers Club.
No, that isn't either. My friend is going to, Janet is going to be upset that I cannot remember the title of the club that she's an American, but still is a member of right across the street. This is
not the Travellers?
I don't know. It's not the Travelers, and I'm trying. It's been featured in a lot of films, as what hasn't, but nonetheless, it was lovely to get a chance to see that portrait as it was just recently unveiled. Well. We're coming to the close, sadly, but I did want to let you know that our local bookshop, located in Peterborough, a very English name, right next to our town of Jaffrey, is called Toadstool Books, and they're great supporters of the theater, of the Park Theater. Not only they've given something for our auction coming up, but they gave a special link in honor of you being on Monadnock Tonight.
Thank you.
For one of your books on Charles Dickens, the man, the novel, and the Victorian age, and there is a special link. It's because it's a special link. I can't say it to you. Never write it down, but we'll put it on Facebook. And
Great.
anyone that uses that link to buy Lucinda's book through Toadstool Books, 25% of that revenue will be donated by Willard to the Park Theater.
That's
And
nice.
thank you, Willard Williams, and all of your team over at Toadstool
Mm.
Books. That is so kind and so generous. In addition to him, the bookstore giving us $100 gift certificate that has been bid on already quite nicely, because there's nothing better than books.
Absolutely.
And
I agree.
especially bookstores that continue in tough times, and let alone recent tough times, but any time over the past 15 years is a tough time for an independent bookshop.
Oh, yeah.
But bless them for doing that. And so that's one way of getting one of Lucinda's books. And we will provide, I'm just going to put this up. It's pretty simple. That is your website
That is my
address. And that's
Thank
one
you.
way to know everything about Lucinda. And I am sure there are links in there of how to get all of your books.
There
Yeah.
are. Yeah. Yeah.
And now, and speaking of generosity, Lucinda also has been very generous to us because she has donated one of her books, Dickens and Christmas, to our online telethon and auction. And she will have it custom autographed for you.
I
And
will.
this is,
Tell me what
and
they want on there.
well, I can tell you we already have, the last time I looked, a bid of $85, and I thought that was quite lovely.
Yeah.
And we have until 8:30 tomorrow evening on the East Coast here that people can keep bidding on that book. But lovely. Thank you very much for that, Lucinda, and everyone at the Park Theater. Thanks you for that. We will have links, certainly starting with lucindahawksley.com, and other links of anything associated with Linda, maybe with the museum, the Dickens Museum link, and maybe we'll put one in for the portrait gallery so people can take a look virtually about what Lucinda's talking about. So look on our show notes for that. But Lucinda, thank you so much for being with us from London. And we appreciate it so much for being on our show this night.
Thanks for inviting me, and all of you take care and please stay safe.
Thanks. Bye-bye now. Hope to see you soon.
Bye. Hope so.
Bye, Lucinda. Bye.
Bye.
Wow. Well, that was lovely. And we learned, I think, a whole bunch of things beyond what I was originally assuming we would learn from Lucinda. A wonderful guest, and so many interesting things to talk about. And obviously the breadth of her books is quite compelling from some of the ones that she was talking about. So we will have all those links. And we thank you for being part of that show, Lucinda, this show. We're going to move on in a minute because this is Thursday, which means we have our segment with Kim Graham, our producer, who's also the editor and runs GoMonadnock.com. So please stay tuned, and we will have Kim here momentarily. Thanks for being with us. We'll be right back with Kim.